My grandfather was the kind of man everyone in town respected. He had this warm smile that could calm anyone, and a voice that always sounded steady and sure. When people passed him on the street, they waved like he was someone special. And he was. Everyone called him a hero because of the stories he told about the war. He didn't brag, but people loved hearing him speak about courage and loyalty. I used to sit on the porch with him every evening, hanging on to every word like it was a piece of history I was lucky to hear firsthand. When my parents died in a car accident, I was only 9 years old. I didn't understand much about loss back then, but I knew one thing. My grandfather never let me feel alone. He moved me into his small, cozy house with white curtains and old pictures on every wall. He cooked breakfast every morning, even though he said cooking wasn't his thing, and he'd always sneak extra syrup onto my pancakes. "Don't tell your doctor," he'd whisper with a grin, even though I didn't have one. He made sadness feel smaller somehow. He taught me how to fix things, radios, clocks, and sometimes my own bad moods. "Everything has a way of working again if you're patient enough," he'd say, handing me a screwdriver. We'd sit for hours at the wooden table, surrounded by little metal parts and the smell of old coffee. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper. Even when I made mistakes, he just chuckled softly and said, "That's how you learn." I used to think there was nothing he couldn't fix. On weekends, we'd go to the town park. People always came up to greet him. The mayor, the shopkeepers, even kids. Everyone seemed to know him, and they all had a story to share about how he helped them once. "He's a good man," they'd tell me. I'd smile proudly because I already knew that. Sometimes, I felt like I was living with a local legend, someone larger than life but still humble enough to sweep his own porch every morning. He had a shelf in his study filled with old books and faded photos. Some were from his military days, him in uniform, standing tall beside men whose names I never knew. I'd look at those pictures and feel proud. He looked brave, like someone who had seen the worst of the world but chose to stay kind anyway. He said he didn't like talking about the war because some memories don't belong in the daylight. I respected that, and I never asked too many questions. In the evenings, when the crickets sang outside, we'd sit on the porch swing. That's when he told his stories. Some were funny, like the time he accidentally shaved his mustache unevenly before meeting a general. Others were heartbreaking, about friends who never came home. He always ended with a small smile and said, "Life keeps moving. Clara, it has to." I'd rest my head on his shoulder, wishing time could freeze right there, in that safe little world we built together. He had his routines, and he never broke them. Every morning, he read the newspaper cover to cover. Every Sunday, he polished his shoes until they shined. He never missed a town meeting or a veterans gathering. To everyone else, he was dependable, trustworthy, the man who always kept his word. And to me, he was everything good in the world. I didn't realize that sometimes people wear their goodness like a coat, something that can hide what's underneath. One time, I asked him why he never visited the city where he grew up. He paused for a moment and said, "Some doors are better left closed, sweetheart." His tone was gentle, but something about it stuck with me. He looked away quickly, pretending to be busy with his coffee. I thought maybe it was just bad memories from the war, or someone he lost. I never pushed the question again, even though part of me always wondered what he meant by that. Looking back, I can see the signs. Little gaps in his stories, details that didn't quite add up. But back then, I didn't care. I loved him too much to doubt him. To me, my grandfather was honesty itself. I believed him when he said he'd never lie to me. I believed everything. The medals, the stories, the man he said he was. Because when someone gives you love that strong, your heart doesn't want to look for cracks. It just wants to keep believing. For years, my life with him felt perfect. I thought I knew his past, his heart, his truth. I thought my world was built on something solid, but all it takes is one secret to shake everything apart. I didn't know then that a single letter hidden in the back of his old desk would change the way I saw him forever. The man I called my hero, my only family, wasn't who he said he was. And I was about to find out why. That night, the house felt too quiet without Grandpa's soft humming coming from the living room. The clock ticked louder than usual, echoing through the hallway. I was halfway through making tea when I heard it, a faint thump from above. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then came another sound, a slow, dragging noise, like something being moved across the attic floor. My heart started racing. Grandpa always said, "Never go up there." His voice echoed in my head, calm but firm. I used to think it was just full of old war boxes or family junk, but that night, it didn't feel like junk was up there. I tried to ignore it. I turned the TV on, made my tea stronger than usual, and told myself old houses make noises. But the sound came again, softer this time, like someone walking. I looked up at the ceiling and froze. The attic light flickered once, just for a second, like it wanted to be noticed. My hand tightened around the cup, and I whispered, "Grandpa?" even though I knew he wasn't home. The only answer was silence, heavy and still, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Grandpa had always been protective about that room. He kept the attic door locked with an old brass key he wore on a chain around his neck. Whenever I asked what was up there, he'd smile and say, "Just old ghosts of the past." I used to laugh, thinking he meant memories. But now, standing in the empty hallway, those words didn't sound funny anymore. They sounded like a warning. 2 days later, Grandpa got worse. The doctor said he needed to stay in the hospital for a while. I packed him a small bag, his favorite blanket, his reading glasses, and a few books. As I was cleaning his bedside table, I noticed something I'd never seen before. The brass key, the same one he never took off, was sitting right there beside his watch. My hand trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavier than it looked, like it carried the weight of something more than metal. For hours, I just stared at it. I told myself I should leave it alone, that Grandpa wouldn't want me snooping. But curiosity isn't something you can turn off. Every time I passed the attic door, the thought grew louder. What's he hiding? I tried to read, tried to clean, but my mind kept circling back to that key burning a hole in my pocket. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. It was late when I decided. The house was quiet, shadows stretching across the hallway as the wind pressed against the windows. I stood in front of the attic door, my hand shaking. I whispered, "Just one look," as if saying it softly made it less wrong. I slid the key into the lock, and it turned with a soft click that felt too easy, like it had been waiting for me. The door creaked open, and a wave of cold, dusty air spilled out. I coughed as I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The attic smelled like old wood and something faintly metallic. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly, casting long shadows over boxes, trunks, and stacks of old newspapers. At first glance, it looked exactly how you'd expect an attic to look, cluttered and harmless. But then I noticed something odd. In the far corner, there was a large trunk, different from the others. It was made of dark leather, with brass corners and a nameplate that had been scratched so hard the letters were unreadable. It didn't look dusty like the rest of the attic. Someone had been touching it recently. My stomach twisted as I knelt beside it. The latch wasn't locked. My fingers hesitated above it, trembling. Whatever was inside, I knew it wasn't meant for me to see. But I lifted it anyway. The lid creaked open slowly, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, tobacco, and something faintly like rust. Inside were letters tied with a red ribbon, a stack of faded photographs, and a folded army uniform. I recognized the medals pinned to the jacket, the same ones Grandpa showed me when I was little. But something was wrong. The name stitched on the inside wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. Someone I'd never heard of. My heart pounded as I pulled one of the photos closer. It was a black and white picture of Grandpa. Or at least someone who looked exactly like him, standing beside a man in the same uniform. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 5 words that made my blood run cold. The real Thomas Reed, 1946. Grandpa's name was Thomas Reed, only now, I wasn't sure which man in that photo was really him. The air in the attic felt heavier now, like the room itself was holding its breath. Dust floated in the light from the single bulb, and every step I took made the floor moan. My hands were still shaking from the photo I found. The real Thomas Reed, 1946. The words repeated in my head like a warning I didn't want to hear. I searched through the trunk again, digging past the letters and folded papers until I felt something hard against the wood. It was a smaller box, hidden underneath everything else, covered in layers of dust and wrapped in an old handkerchief. The moment I touched it, I knew it was different. It was heavier, colder, and locked tight. I carried it downstairs, away from the creaks and shadows of the attic. My heart thudded as I set it on the kitchen table. The box was beautiful. Dark oak, carved with initials I didn't recognize. The lock was rusty but still strong. I tried to open it with the same brass key from the attic door, and to my surprise, it clicked open easily, like it had been waiting for me all along. Inside, instead of the warmth I expected, old memories, letters, or keepsakes, There was something else entirely. There was a passport on top, edges yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, expecting to see my grandfather's name. But it wasn't his. The photo was his face. Same eyes, same jawline, even the little scar on his chin. But the name underneath said Edward Miles. My throat went dry. I flipped through the pages again, hoping I was mistaken. But there it was, stamped with old travel marks and dated years before he said he'd even joined the army. The more I stared, the more it felt like I was holding proof that my whole life had been built on someone else's lie. Beneath the passport were folded newspaper clippings, brittle and yellow. I unfolded the first one, and my eyes froze on the headline, "Local banker vanishes after massive fraud scandal." My stomach turned as I read the smaller text. Edward Miles, accused of embezzling thousands, disappears before trial. There was a photo printed beside it, grainy but unmistakable. The man's face was my grandfather's. Same eyes, same kind expression. Only now, instead of medals on his chest, there was a caption calling him a wanted man. I sat there in silence, the newspaper shaking in my hands. It didn't make sense. My grandfather, the man who taught me honesty, kindness, and patience, was being accused of crimes that didn't fit the person I knew. I grabbed another clipping. This one showed sketches of him labeled "Identity Theft Suspect Still Missing." My heart pounded harder with each line. He had taken someone's name, Thomas Reed, the same name that had been on those medals in the trunk upstairs. I dropped the papers and backed away from the table, my chest tight. The world felt upside down. Every story he told, every lesson about truth and integrity, they all cracked inside me like shattered glass. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he just found the passport. Maybe he was protecting someone. But deep down, a voice whispered what I didn't want to admit. He wasn't who he said he was. I turned the box upside down, desperate for answers. More papers spilled out, letters written in elegant handwriting, signed E.M. Some were from people I didn't know. One read, "They'll find me soon. I can't keep this name forever." My breath caught. It was his handwriting. My grandfather, Edward Miles, was admitting to everything in ink. My hands felt numb as I folded the letter back. The floorboards creaked above me, and for a split second, I looked up, expecting him to be standing there. But he wasn't. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. I gathered the papers and stuffed them back into the box, as if hiding them could undo what I'd just seen. I didn't want it to be true. The man who tucked me in every night couldn't also be the man who lied to the whole world. As I closed the box, I caught one last photo stuck at the bottom. It was of Grandpa, younger, in a suit, shaking hands with another man. On the back, in faded ink, it read, "The deal that changed everything." I didn't know what deal it meant, but I knew one thing. Whatever happened before I was born, it was big enough to make him change his entire life. Big enough to make him become someone else. I sat there for a long time, staring at that wooden box. My grandfather, the man I loved more than anyone, was living a lie. I didn't know if he was running from guilt, danger, or something worse. All I knew was that the truth was sitting in front of me, locked away for decades, and I had just opened it. I didn't sleep that night. The truth I'd found in that box wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's face, smiling, kind, gentle, next to that newspaper headline calling him a criminal. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. There was only one person who might know the truth. My grandmother. She had always been quiet about the past, always steering conversations away from how she met Grandpa. Suddenly, that silence meant something different. It wasn't shyness. It was protection. When I walked into her kitchen that morning, she was sitting by the window, knitting like she always did, the soft hum of the radio playing old songs in the background. I placed the wooden box on the table, and her hands froze mid-stitch. She didn't even ask where I found it. She just looked at it, then at me, and sighed like she'd been waiting for this day. "You went up there, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a trembling hand, she pushed her glasses up and whispered, "I always hoped you wouldn't." I pulled the passport out and laid it in front of her. "Who is Edward Miles?" I asked. She stared at the photo for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she shook her head. "That's not his real name either." Her voice cracked on the last word. I felt my chest tighten. "Then who is he?" I asked again, my voice sharper this time. She hesitated, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. His name was Elias Ward, she said finally. Before all of this, the name didn't sound familiar. It felt like hearing about a stranger. Elias Ward? I repeated, hoping she'd say I misheard, but she nodded slowly. He was born Elias Ward from a very wealthy family in Boston. His father owned half the textile factories in the city back then. They lived in a big white house by the river. But everything changed when Elias was in his 20s. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word pulled from a place heavy with years of keeping secrets. I leaned closer. What happened to him? She looked out the window, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. There was a scandal, she whispered. Money went missing from his father's company. A lot of it. His father blamed him. The police got involved, and before anyone could find out the truth, Elias disappeared. Some people thought he ran away. Others thought he died. But he didn't die. He became someone else. Her words felt unreal. My grandfather, the man who made birdhouses in the backyard and volunteered at the Veterans Center, was a runaway from a ruined family. So he just changed his name? Started over? I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded. He took a train south, found work under a new name, George Miller. I met him years later. He was quiet, kind, and broken. He told me he had no family, that he'd lost everything. I believed him. By the time I found out the truth, it was too late. I loved him too much to let him go. Tears filled her eyes, and I could tell this was the first time she'd said those words out loud in decades. Did he really do it? I whispered. Was he guilty? She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. No one ever proved it, she said softly. But he carried the blame like a scar. He said he didn't take that money, that it was his brother. But when the police came looking, he ran instead of fighting. He said starting over was easier than being branded a liar. I tried to take it all in, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. Every memory of him, every smile, every lesson, now carried a shadow I couldn't ignore. My grandmother looked at me, her voice breaking. He wasn't proud of what he did, Clara, but he spent the rest of his life trying to be better than the man he used to be. She reached across the table and took my hand. He loved you. Whatever name he used, that part was real. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But my mind kept spinning with questions. Why didn't he tell me? Why did he hide it for so long? Why let me grow up believing in a version of him that wasn't true? My grandmother must have seen it on my face because she whispered, "He wanted to tell you." He almost did so many times. But every time he tried, the fear stopped him. He thought if you knew, you'd stop loving him. I looked down at the box. The false names, the lies, the past he buried. I thought of all the times he told me honesty was the most important thing in life. Maybe that was his way of trying to atone, to raise me into the kind of person he couldn't be. Elias Ward, I murmured under my breath, testing the name that used to be his. It didn't sound like my grandfather. It sounded like a ghost. And now that I knew the truth, that ghost would never stop haunting me. I couldn't look at my grandfather's photo the same way anymore. Every time I saw his warm smile, my heart twisted with confusion. How could the man who taught me right from wrong have lived under a fake name for decades? I kept replaying all the times he told me, "Honesty is the strongest foundation for any life." Those words used to comfort me. Now they hurt. But deep down, I couldn't believe he was a bad man. There had to be something more. Something hidden beneath the lie that built our family. I started spending my evenings going through every piece of paper I found in the attic. Old letters, legal documents, faded photographs. Each one felt like a piece of a bigger puzzle. I noticed patterns, like names mentioned more than once, addresses from towns I had never heard of, and one recurring signature, Henry Dale. I didn't know who he was, but every time his name appeared, it was connected to something painful. I could feel my grandfather's silence in every page. He hadn't just changed his name. He'd buried his past completely. I went to the local library and searched old records. It took hours of scrolling through scanned newspapers before I found an article dated 50 years ago. The headline read, "Businessman Elias Ward accused of embezzlement, partner missing." My chest tightened. There was his photo. My grandfather's face, only younger and frightened. The article said he was accused of stealing a huge amount of money from his own company before disappearing without a trace. But as I read further, I noticed something odd. There was no evidence he ever took the money. The more I read, the clearer it became that the investigation had been rushed and incomplete. Witnesses mentioned that Elias's business partner, Henry Dale, vanished right after the theft. Yet somehow, the blame fell entirely on Elias. The story painted him as a coward who ran away to avoid punishment. But that wasn't the man I knew. My grandfather never ran from problems. He faced everything head on, except this. And that made me wonder, what if he didn't run because he was guilty, but because he was protecting someone? I asked my grandmother about it again. At first, she refused to talk. She just shook her head and said, "Some things are better left in the past." But when I told her I had proof, the newspaper, the letters, the photos, her eyes filled with tears. "He wasn't a thief," she whispered. "He took the blame for someone else. Henry was like a brother to him, but he betrayed your grandfather. When everything fell apart, Elias thought it was safer to disappear. We started over, changed our names, and promised never to speak of it again." Her words hit me like a storm. My grandfather had sacrificed his own identity to protect his family. He lived with a label of guilt just to keep the people he loved safe. It was hard to process. I felt angry that he had to live that way, but proud of his strength. Every story he ever told me about forgiveness, second chances, and courage suddenly made sense. They weren't just lessons, they were pieces of his hidden truth. I sat by my window that night, holding one of his old photographs. He looked peaceful, standing in the garden he loved so much. I realized the man in the photo wasn't a liar. He was a survivor. He rebuilt his life from ashes and never once complained. Maybe that's why he loved gardening so much. He knew what it meant to grow something beautiful out of broken soil. The next day, I decided to learn more about Henry Dale. If he was still alive, I needed answers. I found a record of his death years ago, along with an obituary that mentioned a son still living in the same state. I felt nervous, but I knew what I had to do. If there was even a small chance to prove my grandfather's innocence, I was going to take it. As I packed the old letters and documents into a folder, I thought about how strange life can be. A man spends his entire life hiding, and decades later, his granddaughter ends up unearthing everything he tried to bury. I didn't know if he'd want me to do it, but I felt like I owed him that much. He'd carried a burden his whole life. Maybe it was time someone carried the truth for him. That night, I whispered a promise to his photograph. "I'll find the truth, Grandpa. I'll make sure they know who you really were." The room was silent, but I could almost feel him there, smiling the same soft, proud smile I remembered from childhood. And for the first time since discovering his secret, I felt at peace, because now I understood that even the biggest lie in our family's history was born from love. When I found the letter, it was tucked beneath the false bottom of the wooden box, sealed in a thin, yellowed envelope. The handwriting was shaky, almost fading with time, but the words on the front made my breath catch. "My daughter, if you ever find this." My hands trembled as I opened it, afraid of what I might read. The paper smelled old, like dust and memories, and the ink had bled slightly with age. My heart thudded in my chest as I unfolded the pages. I knew somehow that this letter would change everything I thought I knew about him, and about us. The letter began with, "If you're reading this, it means the truth has finally caught up." His words were gentle, full of guilt and sorrow. He wrote about the day his business partner, Henry Dale, betrayed him. They had built the company together, but when money went missing, Henry turned on him, framing him for the crime. "I didn't run because I was guilty," the letter said. "I ran because I was afraid. Your mother was carrying you, and I couldn't let you grow up with a father in prison." As I read those words, tears blurred my vision. He hadn't just disappeared. He had sacrificed everything to protect his family. He described the night he fled, the rain pouring so hard he could barely see the road. He took only what he could carry: a few documents, his wedding photo, and a new name he had chosen at random: George Miller. My chest ached as I imagined him driving into the darkness, leaving behind his home, his reputation, and the man he used to be. He wrote about how every mile away from his old life felt like a piece of him breaking off. But then, he wrote about the moment he first held his newborn daughter, Clara's mother, and how he promised himself that she would never suffer because of his past. He wrote that he had planned to come clean once things settled, once the fear passed. But time moved differently once his daughter was born. Each year I told myself, next year I'll tell her. But next year always felt too dangerous. He confessed that the lie grew heavier with every birthday, every school recital, every proud moment. "I built my new life on fear," he said, "but somehow love made it feel real." The way he wrote those words made me pause. It wasn't a letter from a liar. It was a letter from a man who carried both guilt and love like twin burdens he could never set down. As I read on, I realized this letter wasn't just meant for his daughter. It was meant for me too. He spoke about regret, how he wished he could tell the truth before it was too late. He feared dying with the weight of his lie still hidden. "If my granddaughter ever learns who I was," he wrote, "I hope she remembers me for the life I lived, not the name I took." My throat tightened, and I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying not to sob. He had written this letter decades ago, never knowing that one day I'd be the one to find it. There was a paragraph that stopped me cold. He admitted he had tried to reach out to Henry once, years later, but discovered Henry had died wealthy, never paying for what he did. He took my name, my future, my peace, the letter said, but he couldn't take my family. That was something I built with my own 2 hands. It broke my heart to think of my grandfather carrying that kind of pain for so long. He had lived a quiet, kind life, yet behind that calm exterior was a man haunted by injustice and regret. The letter ended softly, like a whisper from another time. "If you find this, I want you to know I loved you all more than I ever hated him. My only wish is that someday you'll understand why I chose silence over truth." Those words echoed in my mind long after I folded the letter back up. It was strange. I had been searching for answers, but what I found was a kind of peace. His lie wasn't built from greed or pride. It was built from love. He had chosen to live as someone else just so his family could live freely. I sat there for hours, the letter open on my lap, the quiet of the attic surrounding me. The light through the small window had turned orange, then faded to dusk, but I didn't move. For the first time, I didn't feel angry or confused. I felt connected to him. Not the man everyone thought they knew, but the real one. The man behind the lie. I finally understood why he was always so careful, why he avoided cameras, why his eyes sometimes clouded over when people mentioned the past. He wasn't hiding from the law anymore. He was hiding from his own shame. When I finally stood up, I looked around the attic and saw everything differently. The locked boxes, the hidden photographs, even the old books. They weren't symbols of deceit anymore. They were traces of a man who built an entirely new world just to keep his loved ones safe. The truth didn't destroy my image of him. It deepened it. It made him more human, more real. That night, as I lay in bed holding the letter to my chest, I whispered, "I understand, Grandpa." For years, I thought the foundation of our family was built on a lie, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't a lie that built us, it was love. A complicated, flawed, desperate love that had kept us safe for generations. And somehow, knowing that made me love him even more. After reading the letter, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd learned. The truth felt too big to keep inside, so I started paying closer attention to the people around me, the ones who had known my grandfather for decades. The more I noticed, the stranger things felt. When I mentioned him in conversation, people hesitated. They smiled politely but changed the subject, like they were afraid to say the wrong thing. It wasn't just silence, it was something else. A quiet agreement that no one would ever talk about George Miller's past. The first person who made me suspicious was Mr. Harris, the postman who'd been delivering mail in our neighborhood for over 40 years. He had known my grandfather well. They used to chat on the porch every morning. One day I asked him, "Do you remember when my grandfather moved here?" His smile faltered for a second before he said, "Oh, that was a long time ago." I pressed him a little, but he just nodded and said, "Your grandfather was a good man. That's all that matters." Then he quickly changed the topic to the weather. It felt rehearsed, like he'd said that same line 100 times before. A few days later, I visited the local library, the same one where my grandfather used to spend his afternoons reading the paper. Mrs. Kent, the librarian, was sorting books behind the counter when I asked her if there were any old town records from the 1970s. She froze, her hand stopping midair. "Why would you want those?" she asked softly. I told her I was researching family history. She hesitated for a long moment, then said, "Some histories aren't meant to be dug up, dear." The tone of her voice wasn't cold, it was protective, like she was guarding a secret, not hiding a crime. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole town knew something I didn't. It wasn't just about my grandfather's past, it was about how everyone had silently agreed to protect it. I remembered the way people treated him, with respect, warmth, and a strange kind of caution. No one ever asked about where he came from or what he did before moving here. It was as if he had just appeared one day, and everyone collectively decided that was good enough. It didn't feel like ignorance. It felt like loyalty. The next Sunday, I went to the small church my grandfather used to attend. Pastor Collins, an older man with kind eyes, greeted me at the door. I told him I had found some things about my grandfather's past, and his face softened with a sad smile. "Ah," he said quietly, "so the truth finally found its way home." I froze. He led me to a pew and sat beside me. "George came to me years ago," he said. He told me everything. He didn't want forgiveness, just peace. I told him that a man who carries guilt but still chooses kindness is closer to God than most. I stared at him, stunned. "So you knew?" I asked. The pastor nodded. "Many of us did. We chose not to speak because he had already punished himself enough. What good would exposing him have done?" His words hit me hard. For years, I thought the town adored my grandfather simply for being kind and generous. But now I understood. They loved him because they knew. They had seen the broken man behind the smile and decided to protect him, not out of fear, but out of respect. I started seeing signs everywhere. The neighbors who always brought food when he was sick, the way people helped repair our fence without being asked, the old shopkeeper who never let my grandfather pay full price. It wasn't just kindness, it was gratitude. These people had known he wasn't who he said he was, yet they never turned their backs. Maybe he had helped them, or maybe they just believed he deserved a second chance. Either way, the town had quietly wrapped him in its arms and promised to keep his secret safe. The realization brought a strange warmth to my heart. All those years, I thought my grandfather lived in fear of being exposed. But maybe deep down he knew he was safe. Maybe that's why he never ran again. This little town, its people, its silence, its kindness, had become his redemption. They hadn't erased his past. They had forgiven it without ever saying a word. I started to feel differently about the lie. It no longer felt like a stain on our family. It felt like the foundation of something good, something human. Everyone in that town had chosen compassion over judgment. In their own quiet way, they had built a circle of love around him. And that love had spilled over to me, to our entire family. As I walked home from the church that day, I passed by familiar faces, people who smiled warmly and waved. I realized that maybe they weren't just being polite. Maybe they were silently saying, "We know," and it's okay. That thought made my eyes water. My grandfather hadn't just been forgiven. He had been understood, and somehow, that felt even more powerful. When I reached home, I looked at the letter again. This time I smiled through my tears. He thought he had lived his whole life hiding from the truth, but the truth had been living beside him all along. In every kind gesture, every knowing smile, every neighbor who never asked a single question. The whole town had carried his secret, not as a burden, but as an act of love. When my grandfather came home from the hospital, the house felt different. The air was quieter, heavier somehow, like it knew there were things waiting to be said. He looked older than before, thinner, paler, but his eyes still had that same calm warmth I'd always known. I helped him settle into his favorite chair by the window, the one where he used to read every morning. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked softly in the background, and all I could think about was the letter hidden in my pocket. I had promised myself I would finally ask him the question that had been burning inside me for weeks. I sat across from him and watched his hands tremble slightly as he adjusted the blanket on his lap. "Grandpa," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "I found something in the attic." His eyes flicked toward me, but he didn't look surprised. It was like he had been waiting for this moment. "The box," he said quietly. "You found the box, didn't you?" I nodded, my heart pounded, my throat dry. For a long moment, I couldn't say the words. Then I finally asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" He stared out the window, his eyes distant, as if he was watching something only he could see. The silence stretched so long I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, softly, he said, "Because I wanted you to have a life without my mistakes in it." His voice cracked a little at the end. "I didn't want you to grow up carrying my guilt, Clara. You deserved better than that." Hearing those words made my chest ache. I realized he hadn't kept the secret because he didn't trust me. He'd done it because he loved me too much to let my life be shadowed by his past. I would have understood, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if that was true. He smiled sadly. No, sweetheart, you wouldn't have. Not when you were little, maybe not even now. When you love someone, you don't want them to see the parts of you that make them hurt. His words hit hard because they were true. For a second, I thought about how much pain he must have carried. Not just fear of being found, but the weight of lying to the people he loved most. It wasn't selfishness. It was protection. I pulled out the letter and placed it in his lap. I read it, I said softly. His fingers trembled as he traced the edge of the paper. Then you know everything, he whispered. You know about Henry, about what happened. I nodded, my throat tightening. You didn't deserve what he did to you, I said. You didn't have to run. He looked at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. Sadness, relief, maybe both. Maybe I didn't, he said quietly. But when you have a family, you stop thinking about what you deserve. You start thinking about what you can live with. I wanted to be angry at him, for lying, for hiding, for making me question everything. But all I felt was love. He had carried so much pain alone, yet he never let it turn him bitter. You spent your whole life protecting us, I said. Did anyone ever protect you? His lips curved into a faint smile. You are, he said softly. Right now, just by understanding. I had to look away because the tears came too fast. For years, I had thought of my grandfather as this perfect man who did no wrong. But sitting there, looking at him now, I realized he was something even greater. A flawed man who still chose love every single day. After a moment, he reached for my hand. His grip was weak but steady. You know, I used to think lies destroy everything, he said. But sometimes they keep things alive. The lie about who I was gave me the chance to be your grandfather. If I had stayed as Elias Ward, I would have missed your first steps, your first words, your whole life. So, if I'm guilty of anything, it's wanting to hold on to you. His words broke something open inside me. I had spent weeks seeing his lie as something dark, but now it felt like something deeply human. Born from fear, yes, but also from love. I told him that the town knew about the name, the past, everything. For a second, he looked startled. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. I always wondered, he said softly. People can be kinder than we give them credit for. I guess they let me live in peace. I nodded. They did more than that, I said. They protected you. Just like you protected us. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Then maybe, he whispered, it was all worth it. For a long time we just sat there, our hands still joined, the evening light spilling across the room. There were no more secrets left between us. Just truth, raw and painful, but freeing. I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I had to give him. He had already earned it 1,000 times over. All I had to do was accept it. Before I left the room, he said one last thing. Clara, he murmured, promise me you'll live your life without hiding from who you are. Don't make my mistake. I bent down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, I promise. As I walked away, I looked back once more. He was smiling. Not the smile of a man escaping his past, but of one finally at peace with it. And in that moment, I knew the truth hadn't destroyed us. It had set us free. I sat by the window that night, the letter still open on my lap. The ink had faded, but his last words burned brighter than ever in my mind. Truth matters, but love matters more when you've run out of time. I read that line again and again, my heart aching with every word. My grandfather had lived half his life in shadows, but he never stopped loving us in the light. Now it was my turn to decide whether to keep protecting the lie that had sheltered our family, or to finally let the truth breathe. The weight of that choice felt heavier than anything I had ever known. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, calm, gentle, and full of secrets. I wanted to honor his wish for peace, but I also couldn't ignore what he had endured. He wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had taken the blame for someone else's greed, and that lie had shaped generations. How could I keep quiet when the truth could restore his name? Yet, if I spoke, I risked reopening old wounds. Not just for my family, but for everyone who had helped him stay hidden. Silence felt like betrayal, but so did speaking out. I walked through town the next morning, seeing it differently than ever before. The postman waved, the librarian smiled, and the pastor nodded from across the street. Each of them had carried part of his secret. Each had chosen kindness over judgment. For years they had guarded him, giving him a chance to live with dignity. And now here I was, wondering if telling the truth would undo all that goodness. But as I stood outside the church, I realized something. Protecting someone's lie out of love is noble. But freeing the truth out of love might be even nobler. That afternoon, I sat at my desk with his letters spread out before me. I started writing, not an expose or a scandal, but a story. His story. I wrote about Elias Ward, the man who was betrayed but refused to let bitterness define him. The man who built a new life, raised a family, and turned shame into strength. I didn't write it for newspapers or courts. I wrote it for the record, for my mother, for myself, and for anyone who ever believed that running from the past was the only way to survive it. Each sentence felt like setting down a piece of his soul. When I finished, I printed the story and placed it in an envelope. My hands shook as I sealed it. I decided to send it to the local paper, not to spark gossip, but to tell the truth with grace. The editor was an old friend of my grandfather's, someone who I hoped would understand the heart behind the story. I didn't include my name. I just signed it for the man who chose love over pride. That felt right. It wasn't about recognition or redemption. It was about giving him back his real name, Elias Ward, and letting the world see the man he truly was. A week later, the article was published in the town's Sunday edition. The headline was simple: "The Man Who Never Stopped Loving." I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching people read it in silence. No one whispered, no one judged. Some even smiled. The pastor stopped by later that day and said, "It was time, Clara." He deserved that. His words lifted something inside me. I realized that by telling the truth, I hadn't broken the town's promise. I had fulfilled it. They had protected him in life. I had honored him in truth. That night, I visited his grave. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I placed the newspaper on the headstone and whispered, "It's done." For a moment, I thought I felt the air shift, almost like a sigh. Not from sorrow, but from peace. I knelt there for a long time, thinking about how love and truth aren't enemies. They're just different kinds of courage. My grandfather had chosen love when the truth could have destroyed him. And now I had chosen truth to protect his love from being forgotten. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. People started sharing their own stories. About mistakes, about second chances, about how kindness had changed their lives. The truth about my grandfather didn't cause pain. It inspired healing. I realized that the story I thought would end everything had actually become a beginning. It was proof that even broken legacies could be mended when told with honesty and heart. Sometimes, late at night, I still read his letter. The paper is fragile now, but the words feel timeless. Truth matters, but love matters more. I finally understand what he meant. Truth without love can wound, but love without truth can fade. The real strength is when both exist together, just like he wanted for our family. In telling his story, I hadn't destroyed what he built. I had completed it. Now, every time I walk through town, I see his legacy in the small acts of kindness people show each other. No statues, no headlines, just quiet goodness, the same kind that once saved him. And I know, deep down, that he would be proud. Proud that I didn't hide. Proud that I chose both truth and love. Proud that, in the end, his story, our story, found its peace. The rain had stopped just before the funeral began, leaving the air cool and heavy with silence. I stood beside his grave, the letter trembling in my hands. The crowd had thinned. Only the closest friends remained, their faces solemn but soft. As the priest finished his words, I couldn't help but think of how strange it felt to say goodbye to two men at once. The grandfather I knew, and the man he used to be. My heart ached, but it wasn't anger anymore. It was understanding. He had carried his burden for decades, not out of pride, but out of love. When everyone left, I stayed behind, alone with the sound of wind brushing through the trees. The headstone read George Miller, but to me, that name felt both too small and too heavy. I traced the letters with my fingers, whispering, "I thought you lied to me, but you were protecting all of us." My voice cracked halfway through, and I let the tears fall freely. For so long I had seen his secret as a betrayal, but now I saw it for what it truly was. A sacrifice. He hadn't just hidden his past. He had given up his own name so we could have a peaceful life. I unfolded the letter one last time. The ink had faded even more, but the words still glowed with warmth and truth. If you ever find this, please remember that I never stopped trying to be better than my mistakes. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath it. Mine, not his. I wanted him to know that I understood now, that his silence wasn't weakness. It was love in its quietest form. I'd spent months searching for who he really was, but standing here, I realized I had known all along. The ground was damp as I knelt beside the grave. Slowly, I placed the folded letter in the earth, right above where his heart would be. Now, the world will know who you really were. Not the name you borrowed, but the man you became. My hands trembled as I covered it with soil. The paper disappeared beneath the dirt, but it felt like planting something, not burying it. The truth finally set free. A breeze swept through the trees, lifting the edges of my black dress. For a moment, it felt like he was there. Not as George, not as Elias, but as the man who raised me, who taught me kindness, who once said, "Sometimes love means disappearing." I smiled through my tears, whispering, "You don't have to disappear anymore." The wind seemed to answer, brushing against my cheek like a goodbye. I stood up slowly, looking around the cemetery. Each grave had a story behind it, a life full of choices, regrets, and small acts of courage. My grandfather's story was just one among many, but it mattered, because it reminded me that people aren't defined by the lies they tell, but by the reasons they tell them and the love that survives afterward. As I walked away, I could see the sun breaking through the clouds, its light stretching across the graves like forgiveness. It didn't erase the past, but it made it gentler. I took a deep breath and felt lighter than I had in months. The truth was no longer a burden. It had become a bridge between who he was and who he wanted to be remembered as. At the cemetery gate, I turned back one last time. The headstone gleamed in the sunlight, and for a fleeting second, I imagined his real name appearing beneath it. Elias Ward. I knew the world might never carve those letters in stone, but in my heart, they were already there. That was enough. Driving home, I thought about how every family has its secrets. Stories hidden in boxes, names changed, pasts rewritten. But I also realized that every secret has the power to teach something if we're brave enough to face it. My grandfather's story had taught me that truth and love aren't opposites. They're partners. And together, they build forgiveness. That night, I placed a photo of him on my desk. Not the one in uniform, but one where he was laughing, eyes full of warmth. Beneath it, I wrote his true name. Elias Ward, my grandfather. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was uncovering a lie. I felt like I was finishing his story.